It begins before the first cry, and before memory, and before anyone thought to look away. And there are places in this country where silence is not empty, it is heavy. It presses down on the walls, the land, the people born into it. In those places, children don't learn language the way others do. They learn absence. They learn what not to say. They learn that survival sometimes means becoming invisible. And this is one of those stories, and not a headline, not a rumor passed around late at night, but a life that began without choice, without voice, and without witnesses who were willing to speak. A child born into a nightmare, raised in silence so complete it almost erased them. And imagine growing up in a house where words are scarce, not because no one can speak, but because speaking has consequences, where questions are dangerous, where eye contact is avoided, where affection is replaced with routine, and routine is enforced like law. You don't remember learning fear, it is simply there like gravity, and the child at the center of this story did not know they were different. Not at first. Difference requires comparison, and comparison requires exposure. This home was cut off, socially, emotionally, psychologically. The outside world existed only as a distant threat. Outsiders meant judgment, outsiders meant intervention, outsiders meant everything collapsing. And so silence was protection, and meals were quiet, nights were quieter. No bedtime stories, no reassurance, no explanation for why things were the way they were. Only patterns, only repetition, only the understanding that this was life, and life was not meant to be questioned. And historians talk about isolation like it's geography, mountains, valleys, dirt roads that lead nowhere. But isolation can live inside four walls. It can be enforced by blood. It can be inherited, passed down not through stories but through behavior, through what is never said. And as the years passed, the child's world shrank instead of expanding. Development slowed, curiosity dulled, emotions flattened, not because they weren't felt, but because expressing them had never been safe. When pain came, it was internalized. When confusion arrived, it stayed unanswered. When fear appeared, it was normalized. And this is how damage hides in plain sight. And no bruises. No police reports, no screaming neighbors, just a life quietly shaped by neglect, control, and an environment that taught one brutal lesson over and over again: you do not matter enough to be heard. And yet, something survived, and even in the deepest silence, the human mind records everything. The body remembers, the nervous system keeps score, and one day, sometimes years later, the weight of what was buried begins to surface. Not as clarity, but as unease, as a feeling that something was wrong long before you had words for wrong. And this story is not about monsters in the traditional sense. It's about systems, about families, about what happens when secrecy becomes sacred and children become collateral. And because long before the truth was uncovered, long before anyone paid attention, the damage had already been done. And it all started with a birth that should have meant hope, but instead marked the beginning of a very long silence. And silence doesn't arrive all at once, and it is built, layer by layer, year by year. And by the time the child was old enough to notice patterns, those patterns had already hardened into law. Mornings began without greeting. Faces passed without acknowledgement. Instructions were given without explanation. Obedience expected without comfort. Discipline was cold, precise, and often wordless. Punishment didn't need to be loud to be effective. Sometimes the quietest consequences cut the deepest. And there were no friends, not because the child didn't want them, but because wanting was never encouraged. Social contact was treated like contamination. The outside world was framed as dangerous, immoral, corrupting. The message was subtle but constant. What exists beyond this home cannot be trusted. What exists inside must never be exposed. And so the child adapted, and they learned to read moods instead of books, to sense tension in the air the way others sense weather. A slight change in footsteps could mean safety or threat. A door closing too softly could mean something had gone wrong. Hypervigilance became instinct. Childhood curiosity was replaced by survival awareness, and school, when it existed at all, was fragmented, inconsistent, sometimes avoided entirely. Education was not a priority, control was. Knowledge leads to questions, questions lead to doubt, doubt leads to disobedience, and disobedience was the one unforgivable sin. And the child did not learn language the way other children do. Words came late, clumsily, stripped of confidence. Expression felt risky, silence felt safer. Even alone thought stayed unspoken, as if someone might be listening. As if thinking too loudly could have consequences. And this is how isolation rewires the brain, and psychologists call it developmental deprivation. Historians call it neglect. Survivors call it something else entirely. They call it normal, because it was all they knew. When you're raised in a closed system, you don't recognize the bars. You mistake them for structure. You mistake absence for order. And there were moments, brief, almost invisible, when the child sensed that something was missing. Watching television through a cracked door, seeing other families laugh in public, Hearing classmates talk about birthdays, hugs, arguments followed by apologies. These moments didn't create understanding, they created confusion. A quiet question formed, why doesn't my life look like that? But the question was never spoken. It couldn't be. And because silence wasn't just expected, it was enforced through fear, shame, and dependency. Everything the child needed, food, shelter, permission to exist, came from the same source that demanded obedience. Love was conditional. Attention was scarce. Approval was unpredictable. This created a powerful bond, one that trapped rather than protected. And trauma doesn't always arrive as violence. Sometimes it arrives as emptiness, as the constant message that your thoughts are irrelevant, your feelings inconvenient, your voice unnecessary. Over time, the child stopped trying to be understood and focused instead on not being noticed. And then that's the most dangerous part. And because when a child disappears emotionally, the world rarely notices. There's no disruption, no mess to clean up, just a quiet presence fading further into the background, year after year becoming smaller inside themselves. And by adolescence, the silence was complete. Not just around the child, within them. Emotional numbness set in. Identity failed to form. There was no sense of self beyond survival, no future imagined, no past examined, only the present, endured one day at a time. And this is how a nightmare becomes routine. And then this is only the beginning. And adolescence is supposed to be the age of rebellion, and of testing limits, and of discovering who you are by pushing against what you were given. But rebellion requires something to push from. It requires a sense that you deserve more. In this house, desire had been starved out long before it could take shape. And as the child grew older, their body changed, but their world did not. Rules remained vague and absolute at the same time. Expectations were unspoken yet rigid. Any deviation, a tone held too long, a glance that lingered, a question asked 1 second too late, could trigger withdrawal. Not anger, not confrontation, just cold absence. And absence was worse. And by now, the silence had evolved. It wasn't just the lack of sound. It was a method of control. Conversations were replaced with commands. Emotions were treated as inconveniences. Pain was ignored unless it disrupted routine. Illness was endured quietly. Fear was swallowed, and the teenager learned to split in two. And outwardly, compliance, inwardly, chaos, and inside their mind, thoughts raced without structure. Memories floated without context. Feelings surfaced without names. When something hurt, they didn't know whether it was physical or emotional. Everything blended together in a constant, low-level distress that never quite reached the surface. And this is what happens when a developing mind grows without mirrors. And no one reflected this child back to themselves. No one said, this is who you are. This is what you feel. This is why it matters. Without those reflections, identity never fully formed. Instead, there was a hollow space where a self should have been. And the outside world continued to exist just beyond reach. Neighbors, teachers, authority figures. They saw a quiet, withdrawn teenager. Polite, awkward, easily overlooked. No bruises. No outbursts. Nothing that fit the narrative of abuse people expect to recognize, and so nothing happened. And this is how systems fail. Not through malice, but through blindness. Through the assumption that silence equals stability. That a child who doesn't complain must be fine. That absence of noise means absence of harm. And inside the home, the rules tightened. Dependence deepened. Independence was discouraged under the guise of protection. The message was clear. You are not capable on your own. The world will chew you up. Stay here, stay quiet, stay small. And by late adolescence, the fear of the outside world was fully internalized. Freedom felt dangerous. Choice felt overwhelming. Even imagining a different life triggered anxiety. The unknown had been framed as hostile for so long that captivity felt safer than possibility. And this is how control becomes invisible. And the teenager didn't dream of escape. They dreamed of endurance. Of making it through another day without conflict. Of maintaining the fragile equilibrium that kept life predictable. Predictability had become the closest thing to safety they knew, but predictability comes at a cost, and because the longer the silence lasts, the harder it becomes to break. Words weaken from disuse. Emotions atrophy. The self becomes something theoretical, an idea rather than a lived experience, and yet, beneath all of it something remained, and a quiet awareness. A sense that this life had been chosen for them, not by them. A buried instinct that whispered, this is not how it's supposed to be. And that whisper was faint, almost inaudible, but it never fully disappeared. And adulthood arrived without ceremony, and no celebration, no acknowledgement, no moment where someone said, you've made it this far. The transition happened quietly, like everything else. A calendar page turned, expectations shifted slightly, and the silence continued uninterrupted. And legally, the child was now an adult. Psychologically, they were still trapped in a world built for control, and independence was theoretical. Money, transportation, decisions, All remained tightly managed. Dependency had been cultivated so carefully that it felt natural, even necessary. The idea of leaving didn't inspire excitement, it inspired panic, because the home, for all its cruelty, was familiar. The outside world was an abstract threat filled with unknown rules and unspoken dangers, and this is how captivity survives without locks. And the adult learned to perform normalcy in short bursts, at a job interview, at a store counter, in brief exchanges with strangers. These interactions were exhausting. Every word felt rehearsed. Every social cue had to be calculated. There was no intuition to rely on, no internal compass formed through healthy relationships. And mistakes felt catastrophic. A wrong answer, a pause too long, a look misread. Shame followed, instantly overwhelming and disproportionate. The nervous system had been trained to expect punishment even when none came, and inside, the silence had turned inward, and thoughts looped endlessly. Memories surfaced without warning. Certain sounds, tones, or expressions triggered unexplained dread. The body reacted before the mind could catch up, heart racing, muscles tightening, breath shortening. The past was no longer confined to memory, it lived in the present, and this is what long-term psychological isolation does, and it doesn't announce itself as trauma. It masquerades as personality, as anxiety, as introversion, as failure. The adult blamed themselves for their struggles because no one had ever given them another explanation. And why can't I speak up? And why do I feel invisible even when I'm seen? And why does closeness feel dangerous? And without context, pain becomes identity, and attempts to assert autonomy were subtle and quickly corrected. A suggestion dismissed, a boundary ignored, a desire reframed as selfishness. The old rules still applied, even if they were never spoken aloud. Silence was rewarded, compliance was praised, resistance was met with withdrawal, and love once again was conditional. And there were moments, rare, disorienting, when the adult encountered genuine kindness, a coworker who listened, a stranger who showed patience. These moments felt unreal, suspicious, almost threatening, because kindness without control had never existed in their world, and trust was not just difficult, it felt unsafe, and yet cracks were forming, and not dramatic ones, not sudden awakenings, just quiet inconsistencies. The realization that other people moved through the world with ease that seemed impossible here, that their lives expanded instead of shrinking, that fear did not dictate every decision, and these observations were dangerous, because noticing alternatives makes endurance harder. Once you realize something is missing, you can no longer pretend it never existed. And the silence began to feel heavier. And not just something endured, but something imposed, something chosen for them by others, something that had cost them decades they would never get back. And for the first time, a forbidden question took shape. Not whispered, but fully formed. And what if this wasn't protection? And what if it was control? And the realization didn't arrive as anger, and it arrived as grief, and grief for a life that could have unfolded differently. Grief for a self that never had the chance to form in the open. Grief for years spent adapting to a cage that had been disguised as shelter, and once that grief surfaced, the silence changed again, and it was no longer just an absence of sound. It became a presence, a pressure inside the chest, a weight behind the eyes. Memories that had been sealed away began to leak through the cracks, not as clear images, but as sensations, tightness, dread, shame with no obvious source. And this is what happens when the mind finally feels safe enough to remember, and the adult began to recognize patterns they had once accepted without question. How disagreement was met with emotional withdrawal, how dependence was encouraged while independence was subtly punished, how love was offered only when obedience was guaranteed, and none of it was accidental, and silence had been the mechanism. Silence prevented comparison. Silence prevented accountability. Silence ensured that no outside perspective could challenge the narrative that this was normal, that this was for your own good. And understanding this didn't bring relief. It brought destabilization. And because when the truth emerges, it doesn't ask permission. It dismantles everything quietly holding you together. The rules that once provided predictability now felt suffocating. The routines that once felt safe now felt hollow. The home that once felt unavoidable now felt hostile, and still, leaving wasn't simple, and trauma bonds do not dissolve with insight. They loosen slowly, painfully. Every step toward autonomy felt like betrayal. Guilt surged with every independent thought. Fear whispered that survival outside this system was impossible. And the past had taught one unbreakable lesson: silence keeps you alive, and breaking it felt dangerous. But something else had grown alongside the fear. A fragile sense of anger, not explosive, not loud, just steady. Directed not outward but inward at first, then gradually toward the system that had demanded so much and given so little. And this anger was unfamiliar. It had never been allowed, it had no language, but it carried energy, direction, a sense of injustice that could no longer be ignored, and the adult began to test the edges of silence and small acts, saying no, leaving a room, not explaining themselves. Each act triggered anxiety, but also something else, relief, a glimpse of what agency might feel like, a sense, however faint, of existing on their own terms. And this is the most dangerous moment in any closed system, and when the person inside it realizes they were never weak, only contained. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? And because this is where the story turns, and not toward resolution, not toward comfort, but toward confrontation, toward the cost of breaking silence after a lifetime of being shaped by it. And the truth, once acknowledged, does not retreat, and it demands a reckoning. And breaking silence does not sound like shouting, and it sounds like uncertainty. And when the adult finally stepped far enough outside the old patterns to feel air on their skin, the world did not open its arms. It did not explain itself. It did not slow down to compensate for what had been taken. Freedom arrived without instructions, and that was terrifying, and choice became a burden. Every decision carried the weight of consequence. Where to go, who to trust, what to say, what not to say. Without a foundation built in safety, autonomy felt like walking on ice that might crack at any moment. And this is the hidden cost of growing up controlled. And the adult struggled with things others take for granted. Asserting needs felt aggressive. Receiving help felt humiliating. Being seen felt dangerous. There was a constant fear of exposure, not because of something done wrong, but because existing at all had once been treated as conditional. And relationships were especially hard, and closeness triggered old alarms. Distance felt familiar, even comforting. When people showed interest, the instinct was to retreat. When conflict arose, the body reacted as if survival itself were at stake. The past continued to speak through the nervous system, long after the environment had changed, and yet something remarkable happened. And for the first time, the adult encountered language that described their experience. Words like emotional neglect, coercive control, developmental trauma. These weren't accusations, they were explanations. And explanations are powerful. They shift blame away from the self and place it where it belongs. And understanding didn't erase the damage, but it named it, and naming something breaks its hold, and the adult began to see that silence had not been neutral. It had been engineered, maintained, protected by tradition, secrecy, and the collective discomfort of those who prefer not to look too closely at what happens behind closed doors. And this is not an isolated story, and it exists in rural homes and suburban houses. In families that appear respectable, quiet, untouched by scandal. It survives because it doesn't look like violence, because it leaves no obvious marks, because it teaches its victims to disappear without protest. And America has always had these stories. We just don't archive them properly, and they're passed down in nervous systems, in broken communication, in adults who feel fundamentally unformed, unsure why life feels harder for them than it seems to be for everyone else. And recovery, when it comes, is not dramatic. It is slow, fragmented, often lonely. It involves grieving a childhood you cannot relieve and an identity you must build from the ground up. It involves learning how to feel without drowning, how to speak without apologizing, how to exist without asking permission. And some days, the silence still returns, and not as control, but as habit, a reflex, a shadow that follows but no longer dictates direction. Healing does not mean forgetting. It means choosing differently even when the old patterns whisper that it's safer not to. And the nightmare does not end cleanly. But it loosens its grip, and sometimes that is enough to begin. And the truth about nightmares like this is that they do not stay contained within one life, and they echo, and long after the house grows quiet, long after the rules lose their power, long after the silence is finally named for what it was, its imprint remains, not as memory alone, but as instinct, as hesitation, as a pause before speaking, as a lifetime spent learning how to take up space without fear. And this is the legacy of being raised in silence. And not dramatic enough for headlines, not visible enough for intervention, but profound enough to alter the course of a human life, and often the lives that come after it. And because when trauma is never acknowledged, it doesn't disappear. It becomes tradition. It disguises itself as discipline, as privacy, as this is just how our family is. Children inherit the emotional architecture of the homes they grow up in, even when no one explains the blueprints. And that is how these stories survive beneath American soil, and not buried in documents, not recorded in archives, but embedded in families who learned that keeping quiet was safer than telling the truth. Families where love was rationed, control was normalized, and silence was mistaken for strength. And the adult in this story did not become a symbol. They did not emerge unscarred. They did not overcome in a way that fits neatly into inspiration. What they did was harder, And they learned to see clearly. And they learned that what was taken from them had a name, that what they endured was real, that the emptiness they carried was not a personal failure, but the result of being raised without reflection, protection, or voice. And then most importantly, they learned that silence is a choice, one they no longer had to make, and speaking does not undo the past, but it prevents it from owning the future. And every time this story is told, even in fragments, something shifts. A listener recognizes themselves, a memory aligns, a buried truth surfaces, and the system that relied on invisibility loses a little more ground. And this is why these stories matter, and not because they shock, not because they entertain, but because they expose a version of horror that thrives precisely because it looks ordinary, because it hides behind respectability, because it teaches its victims to doubt their own pain. And born into a nightmare does not mean destined to repeat it, but breaking the cycle requires something terrifying: honesty, the willingness to look at what was done without softening it, without excuses, without silence. And if this story unsettled you, it was meant to, and not to harm, but to remind you that some of the darkest histories are not found in textbooks or crime scenes. They are found in living rooms, in family rules no one questions, in children who learn too early that the safest thing they can do is disappear. And if you recognize something familiar here, know this: in silence may have raised you, but it does not get to define you.